Alright, you know the drill, I played 3 games this month, so let's get into it. Following yet another Pokemon Presents with no Mystery Dungeon news, I finally gave up waiting and decided to just go back and replay Gates and Super instead. Specifically, I wanted to do something in each game that I'd been meaning to do for a while. Recruit Cobalion and Terrakion in Gates, and recruit every Pokemon in Super, which later became getting 100% completion in Super since there wasn't that much left to do after getting every Pokemon anyway, and I thought I just might as well. Though grinding missions to rank up high enough to unlock Cobalion and Terrakion's missions in Gates got a little bit tedious towards the end, I still managed to do it in a cool 30 hours. 100%ing Super, however, was more of an undertaking. I have a great deal of nostalgia for both Gates and Super, but what surprised me most about the 2 games after replaying them back to back was that while Gates' story held up fairly well, I found myself far less impressed with Super's story upon replay. The plot of Gates to Infinity, though nothing revolutionary, is well constructed, with the subplots revolving around each recurring character tying back into the game's main themes in a way I don't think I fully appreciated when I was younger. Super, on the other hand, is far less consistent. I remember enjoying the school part of the game back when I first played it, but this time around it was hard to see the entire first half of the game as anything but excessively meandering. Up until you and your partner at last take the initiative to leave Serene Village, stuff in this game just kinda happens. It's true that some of these scenes are important for characterizing your partner and Nuzleaf in particular, but otherwise the things that happen during the Serene Village segment of the game don't really contribute much to anything that happens later, apart from the one dungeon that serves as obvious foreshadowing. Then, by the time the plot actually starts, you've already taken on half of the bosses on the start menu, and the game has to fly through its remaining plot beats, not giving them much of a chance to make an impact. Super relies on its numerous plot twists to maintain momentum in its narrative, but these aren't the kind of twists that recontextualized every scene that comes before it, again, except for the one. So, though they land the first time you see them, on replays they don't invoke much of a reaction. Fortunately, though Super's story may not be as impressive as I once found it, it has perhaps the best gameplay in the series. The addition of wands, emeras, and alliances, an evolution of Gates' team attacks, in combination with the fact that every Pokemon up to Hoopa is in the game, allows for a great depth of customization and variation in team building and strategy. To illustrate this point, I'd like to explain how I completed the final mission of this game, the 99th-floor dungeon Destiny Tower. Darkrai is the only Pokemon with access to the very potent Dark Void, an AoE sleep move that, in tandem with its ability Bad Dreams, can be used to put an entire room of Pokemon to sleep and then deal chip damage to them. On top of that, Darkrai also has the ability to phase through walls, so it's entirely possible to avoid most fights altogether simply by putting a Pokemon to sleep and then walking around the room's borders. An ideal strategy, as at 99 floors, even if half of your bag is taken up by Reviver Seeds, you're still likely to run out eventually. If that wasn't enough, and you wanted to make this dungeon even easier, you could use Progress Devices, an item that allows you to save mid-dungeon for the first time in the series. Most of the dungeons in the main story are under 20 floors, so these aren't particularly practical during the adventure itself, but they're very useful in the post-game dungeons that are 30 floors and above, as they allow you to essentially create checkpoints. Making them even more useful is the fact that, as I discovered while trying to complete Destiny Tower, Super generates the entire dungeon upon entry, not upon reload, meaning you can memorize the location of the stairs and locate them faster after being defeated and restarting from your progress device. Then, if all that wasn't enough, and you wanted to make this dungeon even easier, you could equip Darkrai with a special treasure looplet, one which I only discovered was in the game after completing this dungeon, unfortunately, that stops your belly from emptying while walking, bypassing the 5 hunger point per tile cost of walking through walls. With all of these factors combined, this 99-floor dungeon can be completely trivialized with a one Pokemon team by walking through walls to find the stairs instead of exploring the old-fashioned way. Unfortunately, even with all of the options that Super's expanded gameplay systems allow for, the basic dungeon crawling loop does in fact start to get repetitive after the nearly 90 hours of gameplay it takes to 100% the game, which is frustrating, because Super is clearly a game designed around 100% completion. Not only does it encourage the player to try and catch them all by showing the number of Pokemon species you've befriended right there on the save screen and the percent of dungeons you've explored on the world map, but by introducing the Connection Orb system as a replacement for the previous RNG-based method of recruitment, it severely cuts down on completion time, such that Super is the fastest game in the series to 100% despite being the most content-dense. It's baffling, then, that they couldn't be bothered to come up with a couple more challenge missions to get the player thinking outside of the box. The only reason I was even able to come up with that Darkrai cheese strat is because, not having fed many of my Pokemon vitamins, I was decently underpowered for the game's final gauntlet. There are only 3 or 4 challenge dungeons in Super, and they're all based around level reset gimmicks. I think there's potential for more mission variety within the Mystery Dungeon formula, and I hope they look into implementing such things in future entries, if we ever get any. If this was my first playthrough of Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon, I don't know that I would still rate it so highly, something which I can't say about Gates to Infinity, which I replayed earlier this year and still adored. That being said, I'm still glad I finally got around to 100%ing this game after being taunted all those years ago by the marketing, and I do think it's really cool that they included all these Pokemon and gave most of the legendary special missions. I don't think they fully took advantage of all the recurring characters, not really having them talk about what happened in previous entries in any form but the vaguest of references, but it's a small blemish on what is otherwise an incredibly ambitious concept. Ironically, despite quite enjoying Breath of the Wild, it was after completing Zelda's modern opus that I began to feel that the series wasn't really for me. I had always enjoyed the lore and exploration element of the Zelda series, but I had never been a big fan of the dungeon crawling that made up a prominent portion of most entries, and I had started to lose interest in the combat over time too. I found that I could get the things I liked about Zelda without the things I didn't like about them from games in other genres, and as such I drifted away from the franchise. I didn't end up picking up Tears of the Kingdom upon its release, and only ever got around to playing Spirit Tracks because it was a game I had wanted to play back when I enjoyed Zelda more as a series. In spite of all that though, or perhaps precisely because I had taken such a long break from the series, I ended up quite enjoying Spirit Tracks when I finally did pick it up. What most pleasantly surprised me about Spirit Tracks was how much I ended up enjoying the early game dungeons. As opposed to the sprawling multi-floor puzzles that tend to comprise most Zelda dungeons, Spirit Tracks' first couple dungeons prioritize short puzzles that make clever use of the various items Link obtains. The second temple was the highlight of the game in this regard. I'd also be remiss not to mention the main selling point of this game from a fan perspective, that being Zelda's inclusion as a partner character this time around. I do think people overhype her inclusion in this game a little bit, since the plot isn't very interesting and as such Zelda doesn't get very much room to shine as a character, but her presence was still cool as an aesthetic inclusion if nothing else. Unfortunately, I highlight the early game dungeons specifically because the last quarter of Spirit Tracks kind of drags. Aside from the fact that the last couple dungeons veer away from the item-centric puzzles of the early game and lean more towards the sprawling multi-floor puzzles that I'm not as fond of. There is almost no overworld exploration to speak of from the Fire Temple on. The last 5 hours of the game is entirely dungeon crawling, and is in desperate need of some overworld activity to break things up. I didn't even mind that the Tower of Spirits was a dungeon you had to return to, because you don't actually have to replay any section of that dungeon. But I don't think those last 2 visits were particularly necessary. Speaking of which, my other major gripe with this game, this time not limited to the end of the game, is the way the overworld is handled. First of all, the train, though novel in terms of video game traversal methods, moves way too slowly. It would be one thing if there were a lot of landmarks to explore between each major story point, but from what I remember, there wasn't a single optional area on the map. You had to hit every location at one point or another. This was a bit of a shame, considering how the semi-open world with numerous optional islands was one of the coolest parts of Wind Waker. Phantom Hourglass is an aggressively forgettable game, so I can't recall the specifics, but I'm pretty sure even that game had optional areas to explore. All these little annoyances come together to make Spirit Tracks a game that goes on for just a little bit too long. If they trim the fat a bit, it would honestly stand out as one of the better 2D Zeldas. As is, it's still surprisingly good considering the mediocre title it's following up and the bizarre control scheme that they decided to use, but it's still a shame that the game wasn't a tiny bit more polished. I do not understand the hype for Zero Escape 9 Hours, 9 Persons, and 9 Doors. Yes, there are like 2 cool plot twists at the end of the game, but that does not make up for the fact that the dialogue throughout the entire rest of the game is just a disaster. First of all 9 of the main characters are total unlikable assholes for the entire duration of the game, with the sole exception of June, who instead of being an asshole decides to be a conspiracy theorist. This entire game is littered with these absurd moments where characters will introduce real pseudoscientific theories completely out of the blue, only for them to turn out to serve as setup for these plot threads that are introduced later, but it doesn't work as foreshadowing because they're introduced totally unnaturally, to the point where it's almost kind of comical, how they just come out of nowhere. Characters will just repeat things that happened earlier in the game, they'll repeat things they said 5 minutes ago. Again, circling back to the pseudoscientific theory aspect, the same theories will be repeated over and over again with the entire context, which is completely unnecessary because, again, they come up so frequently you're not going to forget what they are. So, at that point, there's really nothing to keep you invested. I mean, the gameplay's fine, but it's not revolutionary. I've played better puzzle games. The puzzle aspect is really nothing to write home about. And so you just end up with 19 hours of just like these complete jerkasses yelling at each other. And then finally, for the last hour, the game decides, hey, we're going to do some cool stuff with all the math that we've been talking about. And the wildest part of it all is that the game plays this completely straight. It thinks you are totally invested in these extremely unlikable characters. The game thinks you're completely invested in them, and it takes its jank story completely seriously, except for one line at the end where Lotus decides to break character and delivers the line that I think best kind of exemplifies every single problem I have with this game. And so to close out this review, I'd just like to read that line out. What the hell? What the hell? What are you talking about? It's 9 years this and 9 years that, and when it's not 9 years something, then you're talking about some sort of fucking experiments. What in God's name are you talking about? You aren't making any sense. That is a real line from this game. A real line. And it just baffles me that they're so serious about it, and then, like, self-awareness dawns upon them for 5 seconds and elevates the most annoying character in the game to the best character in the game. And it's just, if this is the best game in the series, I am so morbidly curious as to what the other entries are like. And so, as usual, here are the end-of-month rankings and replays. And, yeah, I'm about to get a little busier, so I don't know how many games I'm going to be able to complete over the next couple months, but the Ace Attorney Investigations collection is coming out this week as of the time of the recording, so I am definitely going to play that next month. And I will see you all next time.